And I'm very pleased now to introduce Dr. Mark Young from the UK Rail Accident Investigation branch. Mark leads the branch's work on human factors, and he has more than 25 years of experience in the field. And Mark will present us now some tangible learnings from incidents from his work. Please, Mark, don't do as me. Switch on your microphone. I will switch mine off and share your presentation. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Dorothea. Hopefully you can hear and see me. And
yes,
you can. And my screen, can you see my screen now?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. No, don't worry about that, Dorothea. It'll make us all feel a whole lot better because we've all done that at some point or other. So it's just natural in this new world we live in. So thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this conference today. It's been excellent so far. So yes, my name is Mark Young. As Dorothea said, I'm an inspector with the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, the RAIB, which is the UK's national investigation body. Apologies, that's stay on the first slide. And in this presentation, I'll be drawing on 3 of the case studies of incidents that we've investigated in recent years to illustrate some of the human and organisational factors arising with automation. 2 of the case studies involve ERTMS, while the other one involves automatic train operation on the London Underground. And towards the end, I'll talk about some lessons learned for integrating human and organisational factors in automation, which I've extracted both from the recommendations that we made in these investigations, as well as from the wider research literature, which has been something that I've researched myself in the past in my previous life as an academic. So, bit of background to start with. We're already seeing a rapid growth in railway automation. We've already heard some about that. We've got ERTMS in many places and more on its way with its associated automatic protection systems. And I think you have to be careful about delineating some of the features of ERTMS from automation itself. We'll talk a bit more about that. And we've got automatic and driverless train operation, quite common now on metro systems in many places. And an article I read a couple of years ago, it's referenced there on the slide, it was in Rail magazine, suggested that it's realistic to expect widespread driverless operation on the main line, so not metros, but the main line, in sometime in the 2030s. I don't know how realistic that is. I mean, that's 3 years old, that article now. Just to put that in context, I happened to pick up a report just the other day from 2010 talking about how ERTMS level 3 would be widespread within 10-15 years. Well, we've already had 10 years past, and that doesn't seem to have happened yet. So that's moving forward by itself. Apologies for that. And that's all very well, and automation undoubtedly has many benefits across domains. We've heard a bit about aviation yesterday. It's been applied in automotive as well more recently, but as we know from experience in those domains, those benefits are not always realised, and in fact automation can cause its own problems for human and system performance. And the problem isn't automation as such, but it's the supervisory or shared control associated with intermediate levels of automation. And on the right hand side of the slide there, we've got the grades of automation taxonomy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I know one of the presentations yesterday referred to GOA2. It's debatable how useful these kind of taxonomies are. There's some debate in the research literature about these because they tend to be engineering led rather than human centered. But what we can see from this particular taxonomy is there's a tipping point between grade 1 and grade 2 when the balance of control shifts to the automated system, and then the human essentially becomes a supervisor of that system. And in fact, it's not until we actually get to grade 4 can we take people out of the equation entirely and stop worrying about some of these issues of human and organ factors with automation. But that is certainly some way off in the future until we get to that fully hands-free, feet-free and mind-free driving, whether that's in trains, cars or aeroplanes. So I mentioned ERTMS, and by way of background to the case studies I'll be presenting in a moment, I'll talk a bit about the application of ERTMS in the UK, which is currently limited to a pilot scheme on a couple of lines in North Wales, known as the Cambrian lines. And if I can bring a pointer up on screen, I hope you can see what I'm going to point at. So these run from Shrewsbury, just near the England-Wales border, to Dovey Junction. And from there, the Cambrian main line goes down to Aberystwyth, while the Cambrian coastline goes up to Pwllheli. And signalling for these lines is controlled from the control centre here at Machynlleth. The implementation on the Cambrian lines is ETCS level 2. So on that hierarchy, that's effectively grade 1 automation, I think. So it mostly has no line side signals, but there's still some signs, including some speed signs for when operating in degraded modes. We'll see one of those in a second. And they've also got block marker boards, which again, I'm sure many are familiar with. You can see one just in the picture here, and those denote the end of movement authorities. Oh, my light's gone off because I'm not moving around in this room. Another aspect of automation, I'm sitting in the dark now because I've not been moving in this room. Automatic lights. I'm just going to carry on in the dark and I'll put those back on in a sec. In the absence of line side signals, the speed restrictions and movement authorities are displayed on the in-cab driver machine interface, the DMI. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just to explain, you can see in the picture the maximum permitted speed is indicated on the speed hook. Again, bring up my pointer. If I can, there we go. So there's the speed hook, and that shows the maximum permitted speed. And also it reduces on the approach to an end of movement authority, so effectively a red signal. So that gradually decreases down to 0. And if the driver exceeds that speed limit by just a few kilometers an hour, they get first a warning, and then if they go a few kilometers an hour more or don't correct the speed, they get an automatic brake intervention. The DMI gets its information about speed restrictions and movement authorities from that control centre that I mentioned in Machynlleth, and these are sent and received as radio data via a dedicated GSM mobile phone, essentially network. So that brings me to the first case study, which occurred back in 2011, actually, on that Cambrian main line, the one that goes down to Aberystwyth, and this actually happened near Aberystwyth at a place called Llanbadarn level crossing. And it's a near miss incident involving a passenger train running onto the crossing while the barriers were raised. Unfortunately, there were no road users on the crossing at the time. This picture was taken, you can see a car in that picture, but it was taken as part of the investigation work. I need to explain a bit about how the crossing works before I talk in more detail about what happened. So Llanbadarn is an automatic barrier crossing locally monitored. It's automatic because the crossing sequence to lower the barriers is triggered when a train passes a certain point on the track, known as the strike-in point. And it's locally monitored because the train driver has to check this signal at the line side to ensure the crossing is working correctly. So assuming the barriers are lowered correctly and the road traffic lights are operating, that signal will show a flashing white light to the train driver, otherwise it shows a flashing red light. And the situation here is complicated slightly by the presence of another level crossing nearby, which is for a heritage railway. You can just about see it in the background of this picture here. And our crossing, the one at the front of the picture, takes priority, but the train driver has to press a plunger, a push button, before leaving Aberystwyth station to get that priority. So that effectively tells both crossings that his train is on its way. However, there's a timer associated with that plunger. So an approaching train will only start the crossing sequence at Llanbadarn if it has reached that striking point within 10 minutes of the plunger being pressed. That's quite an important detail. I'll explain why in a moment. And the other complication with this setup is that the ETCS system is not fully interfaced with the crossing. So the DMI in the cab will provide a warning that the driver is approaching the crossing via an auditory alert and a text message. It will also monitor the train's maximum speed, which is 65 kilometers an hour over the crossing, but there's no other protection. Sorry, apologies. But there's no other protection on this. The driver is still required to monitor that line side signal on the approach, and the ERTMS system can still grant a movement authority over the crossing, even if it's still open to road traffic. So on the day of the incident, the train was running late into and out of Aberystwyth station. It's a terminal station. The driver, while he was changing ends, going from one cab to the other, pressed the plunger on the station platform, but they had problems setting up the cab at the other end to become the leading end due to issues in setting the route by the signaller. So the driver had to reset the ETCS system, which meant it didn't know its position, which meant it had to start in staff responsible SR mode until it had passed the Belize on the track. On its way out of the station, the train was then transitioning from staff responsible to on-site and then to full supervision modes. And the driver was intently watching the speedometer so as not to overspeed. By now, though, that 10-minute timer had timed out, expired. So before the train reached the striking point, and there was no indication on the DMI that this had happened. The driver passed the sighting board, which is a sort of point of no return on the railway, a couple of seconds after reaching his 65 km/h speed, and he was still adjusting power, so still head down, when he did then look up and notice that signal, the driver's crossing indicator, that red flashing light, and it was still flashing red, and by that point it was too late to stop. So to sum up on this one, using RAIB's standard causal factor structure, the first causal factor was the driver's workload. So the driver's attention was largely focused down on the DMI for his departure from Aberystwyth, and there was a higher than usual demand given he was departing in staff responsible mode. The underlying factor here was that the ETCS doesn't interface with the automatic crossings on the Cambrian lines. Network Rail had previously done some work on this, concluded that the costs of doing this interfacing outweighed the benefits, but there was no human factors analysis in those risk assessments. And the investigation recommendations included the development of engineered safeguards to reduce the risk of ERTMS trains passing over automatic crossings when the crossings haven't operated, and that this should also include a human factors risk assessment, and also to carry out a human factors analysis and risk assessment of train driver workload on departing from Aberystwyth. Second case study is a bit more recent. It's about a loss of temporary speed restrictions, or TSRs, on the Cambrian coastline, and this occurred in October 2017. The speed restrictions, these temporary speed restrictions are associated with sighting times for level crossings on that line, so that the users of those crossings have enough warning of an approaching train, and the speed restrictions should be presented to drivers on the DMI. However, on the morning of the 20th of October, 4 trains travelled over the line without showing 7 of these speed restrictions, and in one case, one of the trains approached a level crossing which had a speed restriction of 30 kilometres an hour, and the train approached it at 80 kilometres an hour. And the problem here, and the investigation itself actually, was largely technical. A reboot of a computer in the control centre overnight resulted in the speed restriction data not being uploaded due to a corrupted database. But because the signaler's display was holding data from before the reboot, it incorrectly showed the speed restrictions as having been loaded to the signalers. There was a subtle clue to the problem in the appearance of these flags on the display. You can't see that pointer again. Let me try and do that again. So these flags, and they actually change from red to green during the reboot process, but signalers are not required to watch that rebooting process, and there was nothing to suggest they knew of anything unusual after the reboot had occurred. The investigation made a number of technical recommendations. I said it was a very technical investigation and learning points. One of them was relevant to human factors in highlighting the role that train drivers can play in avoiding incidents by promptly reporting inconsistencies between the information they read in their written notices, their paper notices, and they still include the temporary speed restrictions, and the conflict between those and the other information presented to them, i.e. on the DMI. Following this investigation, we helped an MSc student, a master's student from Loughborough University, Ailam Thron, and she used the case study as part of her thesis on using the STAMP method, Systems Theoretic Accident Model and Processes, a human factors accident analysis method, and her interest was to try and anticipate cybersecurity implications for the future digital railway. And her findings highlighted the role that signallers can play in system resilience thanks to their observation skills, their attention to detail, so they're well placed to spot some of these emerging problems. But as she observed, there's been few of these kinds of studies focusing on signallers, and due to their ever evolving responsibilities, they're the ones most affected by some of this automation. Ailam also highlighted the need to understand the impact of the digital railway on the wider socio-technical system, addressing problems such as system integration and the opacity of complex systems rather than just focusing on individual performance. That opacity is a big thing again in the automation literature. A lot of people talk about transparency in the interface design so that the users know what's going on with the automation. The final case study takes us to Notting Hill Gate Station on the London Underground. It's at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, the 31st of January 2018, and this passenger, get the pointer up again. So this passenger here has actually got trapped in the closing doors of this Central Line train as she was trying to board. Passenger was a 78-year-old woman. She'd entered the platform while the train was coming in, and she was moving forwards along the platform as it slowed down and came to a stop. Doors then opened. They were open for 9 seconds, during which time she kept on moving forwards, and then the door close sequence started with the hustle alarm, the beep 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 to close the doors, and that took her by surprise. So she then moved to the nearest door to her on the platform to try and board, and she was carrying a bag. You can see it in the picture there, and that was wrapped around her wrist. That swung into the closing door and was trapped on the inside of the train. She couldn't free herself. It was wrapped around her wrist. She couldn't get out of it, and she was then dragged along the platform, 75 metres along the platform, and about 10-15 metres into the tunnel before the train actually came to a stop, and the emergency brakes were applied about 10 seconds after it started moving, and the passenger suffered some quite serious injuries as a result of this. So as before, I need to give you a bit of background, a bit of context about these Central Line trains and how they operate. So they're controlled by automatic train operation, ATO, which is effectively, to my mind, grade 2 automation. So the train runs automatically between stations, and the train operator in the cab takes care of the station duties. So that means opening the doors, scanning the platform train interface using the 12-inch LCD CCTV monitor in the cab, closing the doors when it's safe to do so, and having checked the platform train interface once more to make sure it's clear, pressing the train start buttons, which are just here, for the automation to take over again until the next stop. A couple of other displays are worth pointing out on the primary display panel. So this yellow strip is a countdown timer, which starts on arrival into each station. It sounds a chime, typically about 20 or 30 seconds, it depends on the station, and that's to encourage on-time running. And you've also got a blue light just here, just above the clock, and that they call that a pilot light. That indicates when the system has detected the doors are closed, releasing the interlock, which then allows the train to take power, or the driver to take power. Well, no, it's just the train to take power. But as with most traction door interlock systems, it cannot detect very thin objects, such as the straps of the bag that the passenger was holding. In this case, the system detects objects down to about 6 or 8 millimeters thick, and the bag straps, we measured them to be 3 millimeters thick. Now, in this case, the train operator didn't perceive the passenger trapped in the doors, and we determined this was because of the low workload associated with the task and the repetitive actions associated with operating an ATO train, and that had led to, on the train operator side, automatic responding. So not mechanical automatic, but cognitively automatic in this case. And our analysis showed that his visual scanning times for the CCTV monitor were relatively short compared to research for this number of monitors. And when we looked at his journey up until Notting Hill Gate, his actions at each station showed really quite consistent timings in terms of when he pressed the buttons, that kind of thing. And that further suggested that his task had become cognitively automatic. There was also some evidence of reliance on that blue interlock light, with it being seen as an indicator that it's safe to depart. So once you get that light, it's assumed that everything's okay and locked and safe to go, as well as reliance on the ATO system itself. And we have witness evidence suggesting that it takes some effort to maintain attention when using ATO. So they have to actually put in some effort to maintain their attention and concentration. And finally, there was a phenomenon of it's called inattentional blindness that we got some input from academics on this investigation. So inattentional blindness occurs during visual search tasks such as this, when the actual targets are comparatively rare. So spotting somebody actually trapped in the door, rather than what occurs much more commonly on the London Underground, of someone just being in close proximity to the train. And there's quite a bit of research on this phenomenon in other domains, with like police officers looking for weapons, that kind of thing. And in those studies, actually about a third of people, quite a high proportion of experienced operators, can miss these targets. And they also exhibit faster reaction times to make a negative decision like that, which is again consistent with the evidence that we got from this investigation. We also considered the fundamental visual conspicuity of the passenger on the CCTV monitor. And this image here shows the layout of the images at Notting Hill Gate. So you've got 5 images because of the, get my pointer working again, because of the nature of the platform, it's a curved platform, and the length of the train. You've got 5 images, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, showing the length of the train. These images were taken from post-incident observations, so I took this during the investigation as part of the cab ride, but the images themselves aren't recorded, so we had to reconstruct the image in the bottom left, which is the one where our passenger would have been displayed to the driver. And you can see in this computer model that one of my colleagues developed for this, in the lady there just in the corner, towards the back of the image there. Now, because she's been put towards the background of that image, her image size in terms of visual angle for the driver's eye point, and also the percentage of the image height, is approaching. It didn't get below, but it was quite close to the limits of discernibility as defined by London Underground's own standard in this area. Nevertheless, in this image here, which was a few seconds just after the doors closed, but a few seconds before the train departed, she does look clearly visible on that. Contrast that with this image, which was actually when the train, just before the train started moving. And by now, a couple of passengers have come to apparently to the aid of the passenger, and you can just about see them. Sorry, my computer's going to stick out. Well, I've lost my pointer. Oh, there we go. So you can just about see the people sort of covering or obscuring the passenger, the view of the passenger to the driver there at that time. So just at the time of departure. So we identified an underlying factor from this investigation associated with operator training in terms of the visual scanning strategies to optimise detection on those CCTV monitors, and also awareness of those limitations of the traction door interlock system. And we also found that London Underground's procedures relied on the vigilance of train operators without recognising the impact of automation on their attention. While the use of non-technical skills, such as risk-triggered commentary, might be a suitable mitigation for these attentional issues, it's far better to design them out in the first place, either through design of the task or of the equipment itself. And our recommendation in this area focused on task design strategies to maintain attention and awareness while using automatic train operation, such as interspersing periods of manual driving, just as an example. So my last slide to conclude. So although automation is often seen as a means to improve performance and reduce the impact of human error, as we have seen, it can actually create new problems, and this is consistent with a lot of literature as well, associated with the need to coordinate the actions of both the human and the automation. Research shows that many of these problems are actually related to mental models, so the user's understanding of what the system's doing and how it works, trust and over-reliance on the system, which can lead to that, what I think is a horrible word, of complacency, where people think that the system's more reliable than it actually is, and also their workload, which can either be too high or too low. Experience in aviation shows that actually automation increases workload when in phases of flight when it's already high, and decreases workload in phases when it's already low, and they call that clumsy automation in the literature. But both overload and underload are equally bad for performance. Now, in an ideal world, these issues would be designed out from the outset, rather than relying on training people to pay more attention or something like that. However, I think training can be useful to develop appropriate mental models in users, such as the limitations of the traction door interlock that we saw in the Notting Hill Gate example. The railway, as we know, is already a complex system, even a system of systems, and automation just adds another layer to that complexity. And being a complex system, that can have unanticipated consequences in terms of how the people involved work with the automation. In fact, there's a growing opinion within the human factors community and research literature that we should actually hold back from implementing intermediate levels of automation until we get to a point with the technology when we can just jump straight to that grade 4 full automation and remove the problems entirely. Happy to talk more about that in questions. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was very, very interesting to see how incidents happen due to the interaction of humans and automatical procedures, or humans and machines. There is a lot of competence needed for you as an investigator, technical competence, ERTMS, you talked about IT, cybersecurity, ATO. How do you ensure at the RAIB the competence in human and organizational factors of the investigators?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point, and to my mind, these issues are just going to be increasing in the future. So it is important that we are well resourced for that. So we're very fortunate here at the RAIB because we have 2 people who, including myself, with expertise in human factors, and we're about to employ a new person as well as an inspector, also with human factors expertise. So in January we'll have 3 of our inspectors who have trained in human factors, and we also provide training to our colleagues who work in other disciplines. So we provide the human factors training and awareness for them, as well as supporting other investigations in the branch. As you can well imagine, I'm sure most of the investigations, regardless of automation or not, have an element of human factors in them. So we get quite busy in terms of supporting other people. But I think with regards to automation going forwards, and I mentioned with the Cambrian investigation, it was a very technical investigation. A colleague of mine led that, who's an expert in signal engineering, and he got very into the technical side of it, and it was a very detailed, very in-depth, very lengthy investigation because of that. And those issues are going to be quite very much to the fore in the future. In fact, our chief inspector in our annual report this year brought this up as a key issue as we go forward and use more and more of these technical systems. The software issues as well as the human factors issues are going to be more and more important in the future. So we need to stay on top of this. It's great to have conferences like this where we are raising and maintaining awareness of these issues. Let's say in the RAIB, we have 3 people to support that, but the technical side of things as well, it's important that we collaborate in multidisciplinary teams.
As an investigator, which tools and techniques do you use to identify human factors as opposed to design or system failures? Do you have specific tools, specific models you use for... Are you hearing me? My mic is on.
So somebody muted. My microphone became muted. Apologies.
Okay, perfect.
That was another piece of automation that I wasn't. I didn't do that. What was I saying? Methods and tools. Yeah, that's something we get asked quite a lot, actually, and we have a variety of tools that we use in the RAIB. I personally think that it's a matter of a bit of mindset, so a bit of taking the right approach to the investigation, and a bit of expertise and technical background. The tools are exactly that. They are tools to help you represent the analysis. So we do use everything from fault trees, timeline analyses, through to occasionally axie maps. We're trained in STAMP and variety of these other tools. But I think they are important and they have their uses, but I think that's less important than actually getting the evidence and taking the right approach to the investigation in the first place. Regarding human factors, I think it's about making sure that you've got that awareness when you're gathering the evidence as much as anything else, so that you're actually collecting the right evidence regarding witness interviews, their understanding of the systems, that kind of thing. So yes, we have the tools, but we also have, I think it's about mindset as much as anything else.
Mark, do you have any recommendations about what methodology to use to assess the quantitative contribution of human errors in hazard analysis?
Is that in terms of human reliability? Is that where the question is coming from?
It is the quantitative contribution of human errors in hazard analysis. That's what I read here. Okay,
so there's sort of two ways to take that question. Is why I was asking. That could be about how many human errors are there in a system, or it could be about the reliability of human performance when executing a certain task. Both of which I sort of have slight reservations about doing. I mean, in terms of the first one, how many human errors lead to accidents, for instance, there's, you quite often hear stuff in the media and popular engineering papers, that kind of thing, that something like 80 or 90% of accidents are due to notional human error. I never like those statistics. Apart from anything else, it just puts the emphasis in the wrong place, because when people talk about human error in those terms, what they're really talking about is the person on the front line, the last person who touched it. And as we know in human factors, it goes much deeper than that, to the systems levels, the organizational levels, etc., etc. So I ignore those statistics, and I always think, well, actually 100% of accidents have human error in them somewhere, because somebody's designed it, somebody's trained that person. So we stay away from those kinds of issues. If it's the other side of it, which is talking about the human reliability side, yeah, there are various tools and techniques out there for analysing and assessing human error. In fact, the RSSB in the UK have a tool called RARA, Railway Action Reliability Assessment, which does exactly that. And again, that can be useful for those sort of hazard assessments, and there is a lot of data there, and there's research behind that, so you can do those kinds of analyses. I personally, again, take a bit more of a qualitative approach, so it can be useful if you're, and we have used them in previous investigations where we've tried to understand the relative sort of safety integrity of a technical system versus a human carrying out the same task. But for me, human error is a bit more of a qualitative thing rather than a quantitative thing. We have to understand the reasons behind people's actions or decisions, the context in which those decisions took place, the information that was available to them at the time. It's much more that sort of qualitative, the kind of stuff that Sidney Dekker talks about at length actually is how we kind of approach it. You're on mute.
I put on my microphone again. Would be nice if that could be automated. Some face sensor or anything. We have some questions concerning the cases, the incidents you mentioned in your presentation. One is on the CCTV in the tube.
Yep.
Can CCTV be considered as safety displays? Are they designed and developed with a certain safety level? And which recommendation would you like, which improvement would you like to see to avoid such incidents in the future?
Well, that last one is a very big question and something we've grappled with in a lot of our investigations. I'll answer the first one first. I mean, yes, I think CCTV is a safety critical system. It's a safety critical task, that's for sure, because the driver or the train operator checking the platform train interface is an absolutely crucial part of the departure process. And we've investigated several accidents and incidents involving that check and the platform train interface. The tougher part is then how to fix it, and with the London Underground case study that I talked about there, we made some recommendations regarding the camera systems. There is work underway, and there was work ongoing at the time of the investigation in that area to improve things like the angles of the cameras, obscuration, platform furniture, ensuring the integrity of that corridor down the platform train interface. But I think fundamentally this is quite a difficult task for people, drivers, train operators, to be doing. It becomes very routinized, even in a non-automated railway. You're looking for, as I mentioned in that investigation, quite rare, quite infrequent targets, signals, if you like, so people actually being trapped in amongst, countless times when nothing actually happens. And these are quite small displays, trying to scan them very, very quickly. There's pressure from the timetable, etc., to keep the train moving. I mentioned some of the research, and the research suggests in configurations with such as we saw there, with 5 or 6 or even more in many cases, screens and carriages to be monitoring, you should be spending 12, 15 seconds on that departure check. And that would, certainly in investigations that we've done in the past, you never see people spending that amount of time on that final check. And I think if they did, they'd be starting to introduce all sorts of delay into the timetable, what have you. So I think we do need to probably rethink that task. One of our investigations on the main line we did a couple of years ago, with a similar sort of incident, looked at sort of automatic vision systems, so artificial intelligence, machine recognition, vision recognition systems, to try and see whether there's any research or potentials in the future to effectively automate or provide some automated support to that task, which sounds great on the face of it, but again, if we do that, we'll have to be careful of some of these issues of automation in terms of whether the drivers will then start to rely on that. If it highlighted a target, would that then draw the driver's attention maybe away from something else happening elsewhere? So again, although these things sound great on the face of it, we have to be careful about the wider implications for some of these other human factors, because there will still be people involved in that task.
Well, Mark, you investigate incidents that happen, and the human and organizational factors that are, that are perhaps the cause, or that are implicating this incident. Do you also identify a situation where human and organizational factors work successful? Do we also learn lessons from things that, not only the things that go wrong, but also the things that go well?
Excellent question, and I'm very well aware of the safety 2 movement in human factors and all of the literature surrounding that, and it's a very good point. And I think, well, by our nature, we investigate things that have gone wrong. Yeah, we're an accident investigation body, so necessarily, if we're doing an investigation, then something has gone wrong. But yes, there is always scope to try and understand where things have gone right as well, and we investigate a lot of near-miss incidents. So something has happened somewhere in the chain that has prevented that from becoming an accident. And I think we can learn from those just as much as we do from the actual accidents. But you know, at the end of the day, we are in terms of investigation bodies, we're quite large, but in absolute terms, we're still relatively small. We have a handful of people doing these jobs, and we can't be going out and looking at every single normal event that's happened and investigating those to the same level of depth as we would, you know, a very serious accident, which is really what we're here for. But yes, I see the value in those techniques, and I think we probably could do more to try and understand some of the positive lessons. The other side of safety too, which I think we do incorporate into our investigations, is the whole issue about performance variability, and again it comes back to that thing about mindset I was talking about earlier, where it's trying to acknowledge that when people in the real world are doing these tasks, they are effectively trying to do a good job. They're trying to get the job done. It's very rare that people go out to try and have an accident or to do something wrong, and so we have to acknowledge that. And so when these things do happen, these accidents or incidents do happen, it's actually part of that natural performance variability around what they're already doing. This whole thing about work as imagined and work as done, would probably, I'm sure many people at this conference will be familiar with. Trying to understand how and why people do the jobs that they do actually in the field, you know, rather than by processes or rule books or procedures. And I think that's the other part of that safety too that we do apply in our investigations.
We have a specific question concerning this performance variability. Other than risk-triggered commentary, are there other techniques train drivers can apply to maintain vigilance?
Right, I come from a school of thought. I used to work in academia, and my background in all of this is all about tackling human factors by design. So for me, training and sort of front-end human issues are kind of the last resort. They're the things that you should do when you've tried to design everything else out and engineered the system to be as human-centered as possible. So I'll always start from that point of view, that we'll try and engineer the system in the first place rather than rely on human operators to pick up the pieces, as it were. But I do recognise in practical terms that that's not always possible or in cost benefit practicable. So there will be stuff that is remaining to the front line. I know again the RSSB in the UK have done some research projects in this very area about maintaining awareness and vigilance. I think the commentary is probably one of the best techniques that you can do. There are also things you can do, like breaking up the journey into sort of shorter journeys, if you like, as a train driver. So thinking, okay, manage it to the next point in time, and then think about what the next point from there is. So breaking it up into smaller parts. On the underground example there I talked about, so with the automatic train operation, they allow people to stand up, so you can fold up your train operator's seat and stand up while you're driving between stations, that kind of thing. So a little bit of movement, a little bit of very sort of minor exercise, as it were, can maintain some attention. We've also done some investigations in the past on track workers, so looking at track worker vigilance, and in one particular case where, you know, it's about the length of time on task. So again, it comes down to sort of task design as much as anything else. And again, there's a long history of research in human factors on that very subject. And if you just have even very short breaks in the task, that can help to restore a little bit of that vigilance to keep you going for that bit longer. I know that's harder in a train driving context where you can't just stop the train and have a break in the task. So it does very much depend on what you're doing. But there are techniques out there. But as I say, I would rather see these things designed out in the first place through task design or equipment design than training.
Thank you, Mark. One last question, please. Could you explain a bit more about your view on the influence of human and organizational factors on GOA4 systems? Which human and organizational factors issues remain in GOA4 up to your viewpoint?
Well, hopefully by the time we get to Railway Automation 4, and you know, the principle of that is really fully automated, no human in the loop at all of the human organisational factors move further back up the chain, in my view. I mean, there will still be issues of who's programming and who's maintaining those systems, but all those front end issues go away. I mean, but it has to be, by that point, we have to have no drivers, nobody monitoring that system at all. I mean, there's a lot of work even going on at the moment in automotive, in the road vehicle sector on a similar topic, talking about, you know, the issue of this intermediate state. So maybe I mentioned it earlier on in the presentation, holding back on some of the sort of intermediate levels where you are relegating the human to effectively a system monitor or a system supervisor. And we know so much literature, so much research saying that that is a very bad task for humans to be carrying out. We are not designed to sit and monitor, supervise a system and then be ready to jump in and take over and save the day when it goes wrong or when it goes outside of its operating limits. That is not what people, and then, you know, things go wrong and we blame it on human error again because the human didn't take over as they were supposed to do, and really we've just put them in an absolutely poor situation to do that. So I think I've just re-emphasised that point, that we have to, all the time that there is a human involved in the system, so somebody at the front of the train, somebody in the driver's seat, all the time we still need that because of the technical limitations or reliability of the system. We have to consider their needs and design the system around those needs, rather than the sort of engineering or oriented approach of taking more and more bits away when we can automate them, and then just hope that the human will intervene later. So until we get to that GOA4 and we can stop worrying about all of those problems, then I think we need to be careful about what we do in the meantime. When we get there, as I say, it then moves further back up the chain and we think about other deeper factors inside the system.
Thank you very much, Mark. Perhaps one small, very last question. You being an experienced investigator, when you could give some key messages to railway top managers, what would that be?
Oh, how long have I got? Always think of the user. Always think of the person doing that task. I think, you know, there can be a mindset of, you know, we give people rules, we give people procedures, we give people training, and yet they still make mistakes. We have to consider that there are all sorts of influences on people working out there on the front line, whether that's at the front of a train cab, in a signalling centre, on the line side. There are all sorts of influences on people's work, and we have to be aware of those and consider those when we're designing their tasks and the equipment that they're using.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very, very much. We still have a lot of questions. We encourage all the participants to send questions through the link provided on the ERA website or directly to you, and we promise we will follow up as soon as possible.